Welcome back to Intro to Religion, PHL 1030. We're going over Tim Bain's book, Philosophy of Religion, a very short introduction. In this video, we'll be going over the questions for Exam 1, Part A, Question 2, and Part B, Question 5. So, Question 2 for Part A, can people have free will if God knows the past, present, and future? Why or why not take atemporalism into account, as well as the potential conflict between atemporalism and the concept of a personal God? So if God knows the past, present, and future, can you still have free will? That's a classic question in philosophy of religion. And the Part B question, number 5, if God knows the past, present, and future, would that make the fictional model of creation more or less plausible? Why? So on page 15, Tim Bain talks about how did God create the universe? And one of the options is God created the universe in the same way that J.R. Tolkien created up his novels about the hobbits and Middle Earth. So we'll come to the details of that. But going back to Part A, Question 2, can people have free will if God knows the past, present, and future? So if God, the example here is if God knows you're going to walk your dog tomorrow, do you have free will not to walk your dog? And I will read this. You can find all of this discussion on pages 18 to 21. So if God knows that you're going to take your dog for a walk, then you cannot do so freely. This is page 18. For if this decision were free, then you could refrain from making it. But if you were able to do that, then you would be able to make it the case that God has a false belief. Okay, so it's a pretty good question about the existence of perfect being theology. Is God omniscient? Well, if God knows the past, present, and future, okay, that's fine, but then you wouldn't be able to have free will, or would you? So that's what we're going to get into in this video. So the first response says that there is, this is on page 18, that there is no future. It doesn't exist. You can't say God knows you're going to walk your dog tomorrow because you haven't walked your dog tomorrow. The future doesn't exist. There's nothing for God to know. It's not that God lacks knowledge. God knows everything that there is to be known. The future doesn't exist yet, so what's to be known? All right, so that one most theists would not accept because most theists would assume that God does know the future. This idea of future contingence. So I'm going to bring up this philosophical term. On page 18, he says, this argument generalizes to any future free act, any future contingent, to generate a dilemma for the theist. Either God isn't omniscient or genuinely free action is not possible. So future contingent. In the previous videos, I talked about the difference between contingent and necessary facts. Contingent facts are things that are, but could have been otherwise. I'm giving this video lesson now. I could have been doing anything else that I wanted to do, like the laundry or taking the dog for a walk or something like that. A necessary fact is something that could never have been otherwise. 2 plus 2 must always equal 4. That's a necessary fact. And contingent facts like walking dogs in the future, that's a contingent, or what's he calling it here, a future contingent. So, can God know future contingents? The first response was saying they don't exist. The future doesn't exist. Only the present exists and memories of the present. So, but if that's the case, then here's what Tim Bain says on page 19. If future contingents fall outside the scope of God's knowledge, then creation was a massive gamble, for God didn't know what human beings would do with their capacity for free agency. The God of theism, however, is not normally thought of as a dice player, to echo Einstein's famous comment. And I'm glad Tim Bain brought that up because that brings up quantum mechanics and relativity theory, special relativity and general relativity. And Tim Bain brings up all of those topics in his very short introduction to the philosophy of religion, but he doesn't give many of the details of those theories. So I included optional YouTube videos that describe the basics of special relativity and general relativity and quantum mechanics and string theory. So those are the languages of physics that were discovered in the 20th century. And although I'm not holding anyone in this class responsible for knowing the details of any of the physics, even though they are mentioned in this book, I think as citizens in the 21st century, it is important for us to have knowledge of the basics, at least, of those languages of physics. And it's definitely pertinent for these philosophical questions about religion, and especially about the relation of God knowing the past, present, and future, and free will. Is it possible for God to know the past, the present, and the future? Well, in that quote about dice playing and Einstein saying God doesn't play dice, that brings up two important things. As I said, God doesn't play dice. That was Einstein's response to quantum mechanics. And I'm going to take just a moment to bring up the basics of this. So as it was explained in the optional YouTube video, the dice playing issue of God comes down to the two-slit experiment of quantum mechanics. In 1927, they wanted to discover, are fundamental particles particles or are they waves? Sometimes they behave like little particles, and sometimes it seems like they behave like waves propagating through space. So they decided to do this experiment called the two-slit experiment. They took an electron gun and shot electrons through a wall with two slits very close to each other. And in the back of that was a detector screen. And if the electrons are little particles, they'd go through both slits, just like little bullets, would line up in two straight bands behind the two slits. If they were waves, they would hit the two slits simultaneously like a water wave. Then it would create two new little waves rippling out from the two slits, and those would spread out and interfere with each other, and you'd get an interference pattern on the detector screen of light and dark bands. The light bands where the waves amplify, and the dark bands are where the waves, a wave in a valley, cancel out. So when they did the experiment, the detector screen always detected the particles as individual particle hits. But when no one was looking at exactly which slit the particles were going through, they would be detected on the screen, sometimes way over to the right, sometimes to the left, sometimes up and down, and after a while, all of those individual particle hits accumulated into the same pattern that you would have seen if a wave had gone through all at once. So that was very strange. It's called quantum weirdness. Then they put an electron microscope at the two slits to see which electrons were going through which slit, and when they did that, they lined up directly behind the slits and created two bands, just like little bullets would have done. So that was the birth of quantum mechanics. When you observe these particles, they behave like individual particles. When you're not observing them, they merge into each other like waves. What kind of waves? Waves of mathematical probability for where a particle might appear were someone to observe it. And that's what Einstein was saying. God does not play dice. God doesn't create the world out of waves of probabilities, out of statistical probabilities for where a particle might appear. According to Einstein's theory of relativity, special relativity and general relativity, the past, the present, and the future coexist, and they are determined. So God doesn't play dice. God knows the past, the present, and the future. So now I'll read something from Einstein here. So this comes from his book, Relativity. He says, since there exists in this four-dimensional structure, space-time, so since there exists in this four-dimensional structure, space-time, no longer any sections which represent now objectively, the concepts of happening and becoming are indeed not completely suspended, but yet complicated. It appears, therefore, more natural to think of physical reality as a four-dimensional existence instead of, as hitherto, the evolution of a three-dimensional existence. All right, so the bottom line is, according to relativity theory, the past, the present, and the future coexist. Although we experience time linearly, passing gradually and continuously from the past towards the future. The mathematics of relativity theory indicate that the past, the present, and the future coexist, and what you perceive to be now is relative to your motion through space. And one of his examples was, imagine people standing on a train platform as a train goes speeding by. Lightning strikes the front and the back of the train simultaneously. Now, if you imagine the train's moving very fast, close to the speed of light, it would help make more sense. The people on the train see the lightning hit the front of the train first, and then they see the lightning hit the back, because the light from that rear strike has to catch up with the forward moving train. Whereas the people on the platform see the front strike and the rear strike simultaneously. It takes just as much time for the light from the front and the back to travel to their eyes on the stationary platform. So what is happening now for them, the front and rear strike, for the people on the platform, for the people on the train, they see the front strike before the people on the platform, and they see the rear strike after. So who's correct, the people on the platform or the people on the train? Einstein said they're both correct relative to their reference frame. That's relativity theory. But again, the important point for the philosophy of religion is that, according to Einstein, although we appear to exist in 3 dimensions of space evolving along a linear timeline, the mathematical theory of relativity, which has been empirically vindicated countless times, indicates that we actually live in a 4-dimensional space-time continuum where the past, the present, and the future coexist. He said, don't think of it as the evolution of 3-dimensional space. It's not that things are evolving, because the future towards which things are evolving already exists, according to Einstein. It's an extremely important point for the philosophy of religion. Tim Bain does mention relativity theory. He mentions the Big Bang theory, but he doesn't mention the fact that the past, the present, and future coexist. So going back to the question, can people have free will if God knows the past, the present, and the future? Take atemporalism into account. Okay, so page 19. This is taking atemporalism into account. A second response to the challenge from future contingents concerns the assumptions that it makes about God's relationship to time. In presenting the challenge, we assumed that God is located in time in the same way that we are. In other words, we assumed that some events take place in God's present, others take place in God's past, and still others take place in God's future. Many theists have argued that this view is mistaken and that God's relationship to time is utterly unlike our own. In the words of the philosopher Boethius, so that's 475 to 526 Common Era, God's eternity consists in the complete possession of an endless life enjoyed as one simultaneous whole. The view that God exists outside time is known as atemporalism. So God experiences the past, the present, and the future simultaneously. That is omniscience. If God is omniscient in that sense, can we have free will? So, how might atemporalism bear on the challenge of future contingents? All right. It's a good philosophical question. So, here is one. This event occurs, all right, the idea is as follows. Suppose that you do indeed take your dog for a walk tomorrow. This event occurs in the future relative to your current temporal perspective, but it is not, nor was it ever, future relative to God's perspective. For God has no such perspective. So, in that sense, you can still have free will, because it's not that God is seeing you do something that you haven't yet done. From God's perspective, you are doing everything that you ever have or will do simultaneously. And for someone to see you doing something as you do it is not to make you do it. If someone was to come downstairs right now and say, you are talking to the camera, that wouldn't be violating my free will. That's just someone describing what I'm doing. And similarly, if God sees everything occurring simultaneously, it's not that God has a an image of what will unfold in the future. What God is experiencing is the future itself. God doesn't experience it as the future. God experiences it as God's eternal now, where everything that ever was or will be from our perspective is experienced at the same time. And if that's the case, then God isn't violating our free will. So does that sound convincing to you or not? So I'll just read a little bit more of what Tim Bain is saying here. He is saying, God does not cognize this event as occurring in the past or the future. To return to the analogy that we introduced earlier, God's knowledge of the temporal structure of our affairs is akin to our knowledge of the temporal structure of Tolkien's Middle-earth. So that is going to become more important when we go over question B. Number 5, if God knows the past, present, and future, would that make the fictional model of creation more or less plausible? All right, so we will come back to that. But continuing here in Tim Bain's book on page 20, this objection to atemporalism is far from decisive. In fact, there are 2 plausible responses to it. All right, so for one thing, the atemporalist could simply accept that God doesn't know what time it is now. All right, so the question is, if God experiences everything simultaneously, then God wouldn't be omniscient, because then God wouldn't have understanding of the passage of time. We understand linear time and God doesn't. Does that mean that we have more knowledge than God? So here's how they're responding to that. For one thing, the atemporalist could simply accept that God doesn't know what time it is now. Okay, so could an atemporal God know what time it is now? And if God experiences everything simultaneously, then no. So then an atemporalist could say, no, God doesn't. But a second response would be to deny that there are genuinely indexical facts, such as facts about what time it is now. So let me just go back to relativity theory. Could God know what time it is now? Well, what time it is now is a relative term. It's the relativity of simultaneity is what Einstein called it. What you call things happening now, like the people on the platform saw, right now lightning is striking the front and the back of the train. Those events are occurring simultaneously. That's happening now. From the perspective of the people on the train, the light hit the train in the front first, and then the light from the rear second. So they don't see the strikes as simultaneous. They see the front and then the back. Who's correct? They're both correct from their relative reference frame. So there is no such thing as a universal now of any particular contingent fact, because that event could be perceived in the past from some people's perspective, depending on which direction and how fast they're moving, or as the future, similarly depending on which direction and how fast they're moving. So an atemporalist, I think, to have a discussion of atemporalism without referring to relativity theory's discussion of the relativity of simultaneity is an unfortunate lack. I can understand how it might be too complicated to introduce physics into philosophy, but they should be, I think, synthesized. Now, again, although Tim Bain does mention all of these theories in his book, you don't have to have knowledge of these details. I'm just presenting them because I think it is information people in the 21st century should have. Einstein discovered the special theory of relativity in 1905, so it's over a century now that we've known the past, the present, and the future coexist, at least according to this very powerful theory. So a second objection to atemporalism is rather more serious. This is on page 21. The objection in question is that atemporalism is difficult to reconcile with the claim that God is personal. As the philosopher Grace Jansen has put it, a timeless and immutable God could not be personal because he could not create or respond, perceive or act, think, remember, or do any of the other things which persons do which require time. So, can God be personal if God experiences the past, the present, and the future simultaneously? Wouldn't that disqualify God for engaging in a personal conversation with me, for example? If I said, God, I really need to talk to you, would God be able to have a conversation in as much as God would know the beginning and the end of everything I'm going to say. So I can see the point about that, and I don't know how you would you're going to respond to that, but you would want to bring that up. So the question was, can people have free will if God knows the past, present, and future? Why or why not? Take atemporalism into account, as well as the potential conflict between atemporalism and the concept of a personal God. All right, so can God be personal if God experiences the past, present, and future simultaneously? Whether or not God can still be personal, I want to read, this is from the psychologist Carl Jung's biography, his autobiography, Memories, Dreams, Reflections, in which he recounts his near-death experience. So this is one of the things that he said. He said, "We shy away from the word eternal, but I can describe the experience only as the ecstasy of a non-temporal state in which the present, past, and future are one. One is interwoven into an indescribable whole and yet observes it with complete objectivity." So a lot of near-death experiences. I wrote a book, Psyche and Singularity. I don't know here if you can see that on this camera. There it is. And where I compare Carl Jung's psychology, and especially his near-death experience, to holographic string theory, which is the fusion of quantum mechanics and general relativity, or the theory of gravity. And in that book, I compare what string theory and Jung's near-death experience say about the outermost horizon of the cosmos to a lot of the world's religions. And I'll be referring to that theory throughout, a few times in this series of videos. So just to briefly put Carl Jung's experience into this question. So the question is, can God be personal if God experiences the past, the present, and the future simultaneously? A lot of near-death experiences. People say, oh, my heart stopped, my consciousness rose above my body. I'm looking down at it from an aerial perspective. And I'm rising faster and faster. And the bottom line is, they say, it seemed to me as if I was out at the horizon of the cosmos, at the outermost edge of the universe. I had a life review. I lived my whole life, occurred to me simultaneously. My whole life flashed before my eyes. Then out literally at the outermost sphere of the universe, where space-time is expanding at the speed of light. And we will be discussing this. Tim Bain discusses that. It's called the cosmological constant, the expansion rate of space. These near-death experience survivors say they became one with the universe, the past, the present, and the future. Eben Alexander, a Harvard neurosurgeon and teaches at Harvard, or had taught at Harvard Medical School, he put out a book recently about his near-death experience. That's what he experienced. So there are many accounts of that. So if that is the case, if human beings have these out-of-body near-death experiences where they become one with the past, present, and future of the whole universe, if that is a quality of human life, or at least the end of human life, that would seem to open up the possibility for a personal relationship with God or any being who knows the past, present, and the future. And that is what most of these near-death experience accounts say, that they met God out there and they had the most personal, loving experience that they can imagine. So if I was answering this question, that's this kind of stuff I would bring up. I would say, that we can have free will. Now, still, I wouldn't be sure. Can you have free will if the past, present, and future are fixed? I don't know. It's a hard one to answer. And I do believe in free will. And yet, how can you explain free will if past, present, and future are fixed? Well, you could bring up the idea of a multiverse, which Tim Bain does bring up, in which case you could say, well, everything is fixed in this universe, but any choice that I don't make in this universe, I do make in some parallel universe. And if there's an infinite number of parallel universes, then you're infinitely free to choose any path of action. Although any path of action you do choose is eternally fixed in its own unique universe. So it seems to unite the extremes of infinite determinism and infinite free will. You're totally free to choose to do anything you want, but anything you do choose occurs in a universe in which the past, the present, and the future coexist. All right, so those are the kind of things I would bring into it. The main thing is think about the question, relate your answers to the textbook. Don't strain yourself too hard. As long as I can tell you've read the book and have taken some time to think about the implications, then I'm not going to try to grade you too hard. Just show me that you have read the book. But now going to part B, question 5. If God knows the past, present, and future, would that make the fictional model of creation more or less plausible? Why? So, page 15, going back a little bit. So this is Tim Baines analyzing perfect being theology. Okay, you want to define God as the perfect being. All right, what does that mean? So God's omniscient, God's omnipotent, God created the world. Okay, so God created the world. Does it make sense to think a perfect being would create the world? And then, so on 14, the question is, how might God have created the universe? And he says, some people have said that God has created the world from nothing, ex nihilo, on page 15, as the Latin phrase puts it. A second contrast is that the construction of physical artifacts requires moving one's body in some manner, whereas theists typically deny that God has a body. Okay, so if God doesn't have a body, how did a non-physical being create a physical universe? I will give one possible explanation for that, and that's the Big Bang Theory, according to which the universe came from a gravitational singularity, which is not a physical thing. It's outside of space and time, and yet it's the source of space and time. It's a point of infinite density that contains all of the past, the present, and the future of every particle of matter. And yet, because it's infinitely dense, according to Einstein's general theory of relativity, it's got infinite gravity, which is equivalent to infinite acceleration, which puts it outside of time. According to relativity theory, if you travel at the speed of light, time stops. And according to general relativity, acceleration and gravity are equivalent terms. That's why they call g-force when you accelerate quickly and you get pressed against the seat of your car, or when you go up in an elevator quickly and you get pressed to the floor. It's the same as gravity. So a point of infinite gravity is like a point traveling infinitely fast. At any rate, the point is it's out of space and time, yet it's the source of space and time. And so how could an immaterial God create a physical universe? Well, the same way that an immaterial singularity created the physical universe. And in fact, according to Pope Pius XII, I believe it was 1953, he said the Big Bang Theory is evidence for God, that it seems a lot like the idea of the omniscient, omnipotent God giving birth to everything in this great effulgent moment. All right, so going back to Tim Baines' book, so he goes to the next possibility. All right, so it might be hard to think of how an immaterial God could create a material universe. There are, however, other models that we might appeal to in attempting to understand divine creation. So he says human creativity is not limited to the construction of material goods, but includes symphonies, mathematical proofs, and fictional worlds. Just as J.R.R. Tolkien brought Middle-earth and its inhabitants into being with an act of imagination, so too, the theist might argue, the actual world was brought into being by an act of the divine imagination. So then he goes on to say, well, that might be hard to see the world as God's work of fiction, and he'll go on to address the problems with that. He says, perhaps, but theists should be wary of pushing the fictional model too far, for there are important contrasts between fictional worlds and the actual world. Most fundamentally, the actual world is populated by entities that are genuine agents in their own right, whereas that is not true of fictional worlds. Okay, so are we genuine agents? The other question of, if God knows the past, the present, and the future, can we have free will? Which is another way of asking, can we be genuine agents? Are we really free to act, or are our actions fixed, just like a character in a novel? And that we think that we have freedom to say what we're going to say next, but in fact it's been scripted by the omniscient God who knows the past, the present, and the future. So the question was, if God knows the past, present, and future, would that make the fictional model of creation more or less plausible? Why? I think it would make it more plausible, because if the universe is God's fiction, that implies God knows the past, the present, and the future. So if God does know the past, the present, and the future, then at least the fictional model becomes plausible, because it's just a script. And are we like characters in a novel? Well, we're not. It comes down to the idea of free will again. So does Gandalf have the power to do things? Or are his powers utterly parasitic on Tolkien's decisions? Similarly, do we have power to do things, or are the things we're doing utterly parasitic, completely dependent on God's imagination? It's not an easy question to answer, because is God omniscient? If so, do we have free will? And I've gone over a bunch of ways you can address that question. So again, the important point is that I can tell you that you've read the book and thought about it. These are difficult questions. There's no strict right or wrong answer, but I can tell if you've read the book and have utilized that knowledge while you're trying to answer the question.